On today's episode, we will discuss the origins of capitalism originating in the 17th and 18th century. We will also discuss economic trends which developed around this time, as well as contemporary debates among historians and economists about this period. There has long been a debate among economists about what truly brought the world's economy from the feudalist mode to the capitalist mode. A debate as to what was the prime mover in the transition of the world economy occurred in the 1950s. This debate ensued between two historians, or economists, whichever way you want to call them, Paul Sweezy and Maurice Dobbs. Dobbs explains his ideas in saying that to modify the dependence of the petty mode of production upon feudal overlordship, and eventually to shake loose the small producer of feudal exploitation. It is then from the petty mode of production and the degree to which it secures the independence of action and social differentiation, in turn develops within it, that capitalism is born. Sweezy makes a counterargument that capitalism was not the immediate outcome of this process. The expansion of trade was sufficient to dissolve feudalism and usher in the transitional phase of pre-capitalist commodity production that was itself unstable, this preparing the ground for the capitalism in the 17th and 18th centuries. But there was a subsequent distinct phase in the development of capitalism. Sweezy here made the important point that we usually think of the transition from one social system to another as a process in which the two systems directly confront each other and fight it out for supremacy. But this would be a serious error, to think of the transition from feudalism to capitalism in these terms. There is, however, no debate that the transition of capitalism was a gradual one. There are three important events which hasten the development of capitalism, none of which are give a clear time of when the world's economy changed, but the three being the European discovery of America in 1492, the second of which is the founding of joint stock companies, the first of which appeared in 1602, named the Dutch East Indies. The third of which happens much later, called the Industrial Revolution. This, of course, will not be a part of our story. This happens around the time of 1760 to the mid-1800s. The discovery of America did a great deal to build the capital of European traders and merchants. But the birth of joint stock companies in 1602 allowed for traders and wealthy merchants to pull their newly acquired capital together and grow it at an exponential rate. The joint stock company's money was raised by selling shares to investors who became partners in the venture. One of the earliest joint stock companies was the Virginia Company, founded in 1606 to colonize North America. By law, individual shareholders were not responsible for the actions undertaken by the company, and in terms of risk exposure, shareholders could only lose the amount of their initial investment. Most histories have told that merchants and traders brought about capitalism. Though it certainly helped gain political power for the captains of industries, it has oftentimes been overlooked. The presence of agrarian capitalism has oftentimes been overlooked. The economist Ellen McCallis Woods writes that it was not merchants or manufacturers who drove the processes that propelled the early development of capitalism. The transformation of social property relations was firmly rooted in the countryside, and the transformation of English trade and industry was the result more than the cause of England's transition to capitalism. Merchants could function perfectly well within the non-capitalist systems. They prospered, as we have seen, in the context of European feudalism, where they profited not only from the autonomy of cities, but also from the fragmentations of markets and the opportunities to conduct transactions between one market and another. It should be said that many English tenants did employ wage labor, so much that the triad identified by Marx and others, landlords living on capitalist ground rent, capitalist tenants living on profit, and laborers living on wages, has been regarded by many as a defining characteristic of agrarian relations in England. And so it was, at least in those parts of the country, particularly in the south and southeast, most noted for their agricultural productivity, the new economic pressures, the competitive pressures that drove an unproductive farmer to the wall, were major factors in polarizing the agrarian population into large landholders and propertyless wage laborers, promoting the agrarian triad. And of course the pressures to increase productivity felt themselves in the intensified exploitation of wage labor. Adam Smith, of course, notes this trend in a slightly different measure. Adam Smith, of course, notes the division of labor and increased specialization as a trend which helps bring about the economic situation of 1776. But this is, of course, brought about by the increased wealth and power of merchants and traders, providing the self-interest of a lot of different peoples to help grow the new economy. The products of most people are now not their own, but the products of what have been acquired with capital. As Smith notes in Chapter 5 of The Wealth of Nations, every man is rich or poor according to the degree in which he can afford to enjoy the necessities, conveniences, and amusements of human life. But after the division of labor has once thoroughly taken place, it is but very small of these with which man's own labor can supply him. He then goes on to highlight the natural price of the market economy and how this trend operates. This is not as important to the current situation, and it would provide too much detail. But his second work, he details what is called the national wealth, and more generally what makes wealth. The most useful machines and instruments of trade will produce nothing without the circulating capital which affords them the material which they are employed upon, and the maintenance of the workmen who employ them. Karl Marx would detail the historical development of the early agrarian capitalism in Europe in his work entitled Das Kapital, Volume 1. He details the trends of English society in the 17th century. He says, after the restoration of the Stuarts, the landed proprietors carried out by legal means an act of usurpation, which was effected everywhere on the continent without any legal formality. They abolished feudal tenure, they got rid of all of its obligations to the state, indemnified the states by imposing taxes on the peasantry. The Glorious Revolution brought to power, along with William of Orange, the landlords and capitalists, appropriators of the surplus value. They inaugurated the new era by practicing on a colossal scale thefts of state lands, thefts that had been hitherto managed more modestly. These estates were given away, sold at ridiculous figures, or even annexed to private estates by direct seizures. The French aristocrat Jean-Baptiste Colbert founded the economic policy of mercantilism while serving as finance minister for King Louis XIV. France needed to be able to compete with the Dutch and the English in the Americas, but did not want to allow the bourgeoisie or the merchant class, or the non-aristocrats, to exert control over France domestically. Therefore, mercantilism focused on political supremacy through national wealth accumulation, particularly through the acquisition of precious metals, high exporting, and low importing. Smith references this in Book 4, Chapter 8, in a chapter titled Conclusions on the Mercantile System. Though the encouragement of exportation and the discouragement of importation are the two great engines by which the mercantile system proposes to enrich every country, yet with regards to some particular commodities it seems to follow an opposite plan, to discourage exportation and encourage importation. Its ultimate object, however, it pretends is always the same, to enrich the country by an advantageous balance of trade. It discourages the exportation of the materials of manufacture and of the instruments of trade in order to give our own workmen an advantage and to enable them to undersell those of other nations in all foreign markets. And by restraining in this manner the exportation of a few commodities of no great price, it proposes to occasion a much greater and more valuable exportation of others. It encourages the importation of the materials of manufacture in order that our own people may be enabled to work them more cheaply and thereby prevent a greater and more valuable importation of manufactured commodities. Adam Smith concludes his thoughts on the mercantile system in saying, in the system of laws which has been established for the management of our American and West Indian colonies, the interest of the home consumer has been sacrificed to that of the producer with a more extravagant profusion than all other commercial regulations. A great empire has been established for the sole purpose of raising up a nation of customers who shall be obliged to buy from the shops of our different products all the goods with which these could supply them. For the sake of that little enhancement of price which this monopoly might afford our producers, the home consumers have been burdened with the whole expense of maintaining and defending that empire. For this purpose, and for this purpose only, in the two last wars, this referring to the our war, the 7 Years' War, and the War of Austrian Succession, more than 200 millions have been spent, and new debt of more than 170 millions have been contracted over and above all that have been expended for the same purpose in a former war. The interest of this debt is not only greater than the whole extraordinary profit which it could ever pretend was made by the monopoly of the colony trade, but than the whole value of that trade, or than the whole value of the goods which at an average have been annually exported to the colonies. Therefore, Adam Smith goes on to denounce the policy of mercantilism, denounce the policy of monopoly by the state. He, of course, is a massive proponent of free trade. And in The Wealth of Nations, he, of course, goes on to describe why free trade is important and necessary to building a nation's economy. If you look throughout the history of capitalism, there has always been major economic collapses. Instances such as the 1929 Black Tuesday, the 2008 financial crisis, and the 1873 financial crisis. Other small economic crises such as 1987, 1825, and 1893 also come to mind. But the first true example of this comes from the South Sea bubble collapse of 1720. During the War of Spanish Succession, England built up a great deal of debts, as wars normally did during this time. The South Sea Company was a joint stock company set up in 1711 with the view of exploiting these new markets to balance the power of the Whig-controlled Bank of England. By furthering Tory political commercial influence, it was devised by the Scottish trader William Paterson, and was founded by the financier and former lottery promoter John Blunt, and the new Lord Treasury Robert Harley. The company arranged to buy the monopoly for the Spanish South Sea trade from the British government around £10 million in return for taking on a substantial amount of Britain's national debt. The South Sea Company was poised to make a great deal in trade in South America. But another short war with Spain made the Bourbon-held colonies further reluctant to trade with England, also losing a great number of ships and goods to pirates. And the incredible trade that was promised by the company never fully materialized, and it began to act almost exclusively as a kind of bank. It lent money to potential purchasers, which kept up the demand for its stock and artificially inflated its price, creating the bubble. More than twice the amount of stock was sold to an eager public, and the money coming in from these new investments was used to pay out fantastic amounts to older investors. Some have described it as a pre-modern Ponzi scheme. By the end of April 1720, stock was selling at almost £350, then nearly £600. By the end of May of 1720, £950, and by the end of June, the overinflated share price then peaked at around £10,000, before suddenly dropping to £190, below their original value. In the late summer, then dipping to even further, 124 pounds, in December of 1720. The South Sea bubble had truly burst, and this would create an economic crisis in England, and one of the first true economic crises of the capitalist system. But of course, as we know, many more would come in the future. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe to our Patreon page, where we will upload tons of bonus content, maps, sources, and other bonus features for subscribers.